children are astoundingly good philosophers, right? And it just comes naturally to them. And if you stop and you think about like what a child is, you'll realize why it comes naturally to them. Like they're born and like information is coming at them rapidly and they're trying to figure themselves out and figure out the world and they're constantly confused. They don't know what the standard explanations of things are. And so they're asking really puzzling questions about the way the world works and their place within it, and they're trying to reason those questions through. And so I wanted people to see, right, that some of the deepest philosophical questions, questions about whether we can know anything, questions about whether anything is true, questions about morality, like when or why does one person have authority over another, all of these questions are just present in our daily lives.
Scott Hershovitz is the Thomas G. and Mabel Long Professor of Law and Professor of Philosophy at the University of Michigan. Scott earned a JD at Yale Law School and a doctorate in philosophy at the University of Oxford as a scholar. His book Nasty, Brutish, and Short, Adventures in Philosophy with Kids is widely considered one of the most insightful philosophy and parenting books of last year.
Without further ado, let's philosophize. Scott, welcome to Discover More.
Thanks so much. It's really a treat to be here.
Likewise. So, Scott, tell me about revenge and why you decide to include this topic in your book.
Yeah, well, so it's actually one of my favorite stories in the book is from a morning when my younger son, Hank, had the day off from school, and we were just like hanging around, talking in bed, and he told me this story. He said, the other day, this kid, Caden, called me a floofer doofer, and then the teacher came to talk to me. And I said, well, did she talk to Caden too? And he said, no, she just talked to me. And he was really upset about it. And, I had to kind of like pull the story out of him. And I actually couldn't get the full story. Right? Why is the teacher talking to Hank and not the kid who, tried to insult him? Well, the answer was very clearly that Hank had taken revenge. He had done something mean to Caden, but he wouldn't tell me what it was. And so I just said to him, I said, Hank, you don't have to tell me what you did, but did you do something mean to Caden? Because he said something mean to you. And he said, of course, he called me a floofer doofer. It just seemed to this 3-year-old child obvious that if somebody mistreated him, then he should mistreat them back. And, I start I put this story like kind of up front in the book because it connects up to a kind of academic puzzle that I have in my law teaching. So I teach this case from 1872 about one guy who spits on another guy, and the award of damages is $1,000, which is something if you update it for inflation things, it's like $250,000, right, in today's money. And the court in explanation says, well, if we don't give this guy a massive damage award, then he's going to have to take revenge. And it struck most people at most times through history that if you were wronged, the thing to do was strike back at others. And I think it's a really interesting question why we feel that so strongly. And then also why in the modern world we're backing off of it and like trying to find substitutes for taking revenge. So I it's just think it's a fascinating puzzle is why I wanted to kick off some of the book with it.
I feel like the way I view philosophy is the art of thinking. And of course, Hank and your book talks about that, right? But not just like metacognition, not just about thinking, but I think being critical with the content of our thoughts. But a quick weird question is, how do you feel like your teachings of law and philosophy intersect? Because I feel like philosophy is full of nuances, but laws tend to be black and white.
Yeah, that's a really terrific question. I think that law, when you dig into it, I teach aspects of the common law. So most prominently, tort law. That's the body of law that responds to like one person wrongfully injuring another, and then the question is, what are we going to do about it? And the questions there are questions like, who's responsible for injuries? When do we own the consequences of our actions such that we have to fix them for people? What's the appropriate way to remedy a wrong? And those questions are part of our moral lives too. Think about like occasions when you've wronged someone or you've been wronged and you're asking them to make it up to you in some fashion or requesting an apology. And One thing I really enjoy about doing philosophy in a law school is unlike my philosopher colleagues across the street who are always, making up hypothetical scenarios to explore, they think I have a magic trick because we'll be discussing something. I'll be like, "Oh, you don't need to make something up. There's a case about this, right? Here's what the defendant did, here's what the plaintiff had to say about it, and here's what the court decided." And I think that the answers the law gives tailor to the institutional context in which it works, right? So judges have certain powers and not others. They can make people pay money, but it's hard to make them apologize, things like that. But you've got like a body of thought about, say, wrongdoing that goes for hundreds of years, where people are trying to make difficult decisions about complicated cases. And so I think it's a really rich resource for thinking philosophically.
So, what do you think it comes first? Because I think, in terms of the ruling of the court, of course, the judges or the prosecutors or the legal process is biased. Like, where do you see emotions fit into this topics of logic?
Yeah, so I think, I struggle with this sometimes in my teaching because a lot of my students will think, and often quite rightly, oh, the outcome of this case is a function of the bias and prejudices of the judge or the jury. Like they like these kinds of people and not those kinds of people, so that's who they're supporting through the decisions that they're making. And I think it's really important to have that kind of sociological perspective on law and to recognize that sometimes that's what's happening. But I think my students sometimes think that's all that's happening, and that the reasoning in the cases is not driving the decisions, and I think that's actually wrong. Like the more cases you read, especially when you get away from the hot button political issues like say abortion, the more you get the sense, right, at least in the spaces I work, that courts really are trying to make sense of situations, to come up with principles that will apply not just in this case, but more broadly. And so I'm a little bit more of an optimist about law than a lot of people, especially a lot of my colleagues in law school. But I also like try to convey to my students that even if you think like, oh, this judge is biased or prejudiced, you don't get to stand up in court and say, hey, Justice Thomas, you like people like me, so rule in my favor, right? You have to supply the right kinds of reasons. You have to learn to be a lawyer in this situation and make the moves in the game that a lawyer makes. And so I try to say to them, yes, like we want to keep the sociological perspective, but we also want to try and think the way that lawyers do.
So you're saying that yelling in the court, saying that Your Honor, you're biased, is not the best approach?
Yeah, whether you think they're biased in your favor or against you, it's not going to go well.
So your book encompasses a lot of fascinating topics that I've never read or heard about. So what are reactive attitudes, and why are they important for human relationship, since that's the undercurrents of what you just said?
Yeah, so my favorite way to explain this is through an op-ed that was in the New York Times. I think it was something like 15 years ago now, by a woman named Amy Sutherland, who was writing a book about how animals are trained. So she was visiting SeaWorld, and she learned about the techniques. One of them is least reinforcement syndrome. You don't react to the bad behavior, the things you don't want, and then you kind of like fawn over good behavior, so that you reinforce the good behavior and not the bad. And then the other was like you really reward the least step in the direction of the behavior you're trying to bring about. So like you're not going to get a sea lion to balance a ball on its nose the first time you have a training session, but any step that might lead to that, you really praise. And Sutherland kind of very cleverly, maybe very disturbingly, went home after learning all this at SeaWorld, and she decided to apply these techniques to her husband, who was also named Scott, and he was always losing his keys and flipping out about it and failing to put his clothes in the laundry, which if you ask my wife, those behaviors would sound somewhat familiar. And she decided that instead of getting angry, she would just try to train him. Right? She would see him as an animal, as an object in the world that she could control with these techniques. And so here's the distinction, is between having reactive attitudes, the kinds of interpersonal emotions that we often have, like I'm angry, I feel grateful, I love, I feel appreciative, I feel frustrated when I engage someone as a person. She switched from engaging her husband as a person and having those attitudes about his clothes on the floor to treating him like something to be manipulated or controlled.
Hmm.
And actually, I've had really great conversations with people. I expressed some skepticism about what she did in the book. A good friend of mine said, "Wow, I wish my wife would train me that way." So I think there's like a range of reactions that are possible here.
And I think the underlying tone, and you talked about this in your book, is viewing someone as subjective through the context of the container, in this case, husband and wife. And I know you and your wife also did this to each other very secretly for a while until I think you guys called truce, versus viewing them as an object for the sake of your goals and intention. Why does that distinction matter in this case?
The distinction was drawn by this Oxford philosopher, Peter Strawson, who said that we just have these two ways of relating to other people because people are objects in the world. We are subject
Hmm.
to manipulation and control, and that's one way you can relate to us, right? But Strawson said it's very difficult to relate to anybody that way all the time. And in fact, he thought there was something off about relating to people that way, that we should have these kinds of reactive attitudes that are characteristic of interpersonal relationships, like anger and frustration and gratitude and love and appreciation. One way in which I think it really matters, like just to take it out of like a household setting for a moment, is how we think about the criminal justice system. Like we can treat people who were accused of wrongdoing as objects in the world that we can control by locking them up or changing their incentives and trying to induce the behavior that we want to induce. And often we do treat them that way. We can also engage them as people, right? Where we express our anger, our frustration, our condemnation of what they did, our expectation that they can do better, but then also in a more constructive register, through what people call restorative justice practices, try to bring about some kind of reconciliation that welcomes them back into the moral community. These are really different styles of engaging each other in the wake of wrongdoing. And, I think that there's things that could be appealing about both sides, but, my inclinations are much more towards let's try and treat each other as people rather than, as Sutherland did, to stop seeing her husband or to stop seeing somebody who's committed a crime as a person and just to see them as an object that we're trying to control.
There's a lot of parallels with what you just said, Scott, and my line of work. I'm a forensic psychotherapist, so I work with core mandated population. So on one side, I must acknowledge their crimes, some of their atrocious backgrounds, no matter what they did, because of their severe mental illnesses, because I work with dual diagnosis, so schizophrenia plus substance addictions. At the same time, must also view them as humans in my session rooms, right? Because
Yeah.
I'm not discounting their criminal backgrounds that led them to here. I think we must take ownerships of our actions, consequential thinking, without undermining or ignoring or dismissing their humanity. But I think that nuances the stance that you are able to uphold, many people can't. So I don't really share about my backgrounds too much because people are like, wait, what? You treat and you work with criminals? But it's like, they're humans, first and foremost.
Yeah. One of my favorite philosophy papers to read with my students is an essay by a philosopher named Gary Watson called Responsibility and the Limits of Evil.
Mm.
And one thing he does in the course of this article is he tells you the story of this guy who committed a murder, and it's a kind of cold-blooded, brutal, heartless murder. And you think, really, like, how could a human being be so callous in doing what this person did? And he kind of dwells on that for a little bit. But then, a page or two later, he tells you the story of this person's childhood.
Mm.
And it's the most heartbreaking, disturbing childhood you could possibly imagine. His parents regarded his mere existence as just kind of the source of all their troubles in the world, and they took that out on him. And even his siblings, who were abused in various ways, said he got it so much worse than us. All he really wanted was love, and nobody ever gave him any. And Watson gets to the end of telling this story, And he says, I have trouble forming an overall view of this human being. My sympathy for who he was, or as a child, doesn't fully overcome my anger about what he did as an adult, but it
Hmm.
does temper it, qualify it, and I think we're all frequently stuck in this kind of situation, certainly with the extreme cases you see in the criminal justice system, having conflicting attitudes or attitudes that don't quite fit together when we think about people in different ways. And that's also true in our personal lives. Sometimes, your spouse has said or done something, but you know that they're tired or they're stressed, and it's not fully a reflection of who they are or how they feel about you. So, we are people, as you say, with responsibility for our actions, but we also have histories that shaped us, and it's hard to think about all of these things together.
I sometimes tell my patients that we should not be defined by our worst mistake. And of course, there's nuances and context. Any thoughts there? Because I feel like you can honor someone's personhood without respecting their action. Like Bill Cosby comes to my mind, right? He's done some horrible things as a person, but as an
Mhm.
artist and as the significant public figure in the black culture, he inspired a lot of folks and he did pave the way for a lot of many greats to come. That's a very nuanced topic and could be sensitive, but what are your
I've
thoughts
been
on that?
thinking about this a lot lately. I was thinking about it over the summer. I don't know if you'll remember one of the cast members from that '70s show, Danny Masterson,
Mm-hmm.
was convicted of rape. In the course of his sentencing, people were invited to submit basically like character references on his behalf to the judge before she handed down his sentence. And Ashton Kutcher and Mila Kunis submitted letters that made people quite angry
Mm.
because they were saying positive things about Masterson. And I do think there were things that were criticizable about their letters. You could read them in a way that called into question whether he'd really committed the crimes or maybe downplayed the significance of the rape or the rapes. But there was another letter that was submitted by a cast member, Deborah Jo Rupp, that was really much more carefully written and didn't downplay what he'd done or call into question whether he'd done it, but said, "Hey, Judge, I'd like you to know about these positive experiences that I've had with him and the positive impact that he's had on my life and that seen him have on other lives." I think it's actually something really important about that in a variety of ways. One is I think it actually is the obligation of a friend when
Mm.
other people see just some small part of you to remember the whole person and maybe even to assert the person to say like to the rest of the world, hey, I know this person has done a terrible thing, but let's, as you say, remember that there's more to them. I also think it's really important for the criminal justice system that, before we send people away, Masterson was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Before we send people away, especially for extraordinarily long sentences like that, that we're willing to hear the best that anybody might say for them, and that we're
Mm.
open to trying to appreciate the entire person. I don't yet have a theory of what difference it makes. Like, how should this have been factored into the sentencing? But I think as a culture, we need to be comfortable with the idea that, as you say, there's more to people than their worst moments, even when their worst moments could not be worse. And that, that might help us be a little bit less punitive and, do a little bit less locking people away, which we do an awful lot of in our society.
Mm. So, Scott, what is the symbolic significance of punishment with everything you said?
Yeah, so there's different ways to think about what we're up to when we try to punish people. And actually, the origin of this book, where I tell stories about my children that raise questions in philosophy and then investigate them, really comes from my teaching experiences and partly teaching about punishment. Because, I could assign to my students readings from philosophers through the ages about the purposes of punishment, or I discovered I could come in, and maybe I asked them to do some of that reading in advance, but I could come into my classroom and I could tell them a story about one of my children misbehaving and then ask my class, what do you think we should do about this and why? And immediately the room would come alive because like kids misbehave in funny ways, but also like they're trying to figure out, well, what is it you should be trying to accomplish in relation to a child that's misbehaving? Are you just trying to adjust their incentives? Are you trying to, the claim I make in the book is that you are trying to bring it about, that the child is responsible for what they do, and you've got to kind of treat them as if they're responsible before they actually are, in an effort to help them get to that place where you can expect them to reason through things and make responsible decisions. And then I can ask them, oh, like, well, okay, let's think about grown-ups now, and how does changing from kids to grown-ups make a difference? So there's lots of different purposes of punishment that people point to. Deterrence is a big one. Retribution is another, right? I thought that, like, maybe if you've done something bad, you deserve to have something bad done to you. And as I suggest in the book, I have a particular way of understanding that. I think, as you say, there's a kind of symbolic significance to punishment. I think it depends a little bit on what the punishment is, exactly what that significance is. But I think all punishment communicates condemnation of what was done, and it kind of dramatizes that condemnation. Like, actions speak louder than words. So the fact that we're responding in this unpleasant way really signals how strongly we feel about what you've done. And then I think particular punishments have, like, particular messages. So, for instance, incarceration, I think, is a way of saying, you know what, in light of what you've done, you're not fit to live with the rest of us, at least not for a while, right? And so we're going to segregate you, and there might be other purposes to that. Certainly deterrence, or providing opportunities for, rehabilitation or repentance, are historically important purposes to that. But I do think that it's apt symbolically for some really serious crimes. We just have a tendency to way over apply it as a punishment.
I want to make a through line. That's one of my favorite things to do on the podcast, giving my mental health background. So Ralph M., he is one of the founding fathers of evolutionary psychiatry. He was in the panelist for DSM-5 a while ago. He hypothesizes, and there's some emerging research, the functionality or the benefits of depression. People are like, what? Depression? How can there be benefits? So he argues that evolutionarily speaking, whenever we're in a certain situations, we don't have the energies or the physicalities or whatever conditions set to survive in the most optimal way, then you actually enter depressive state as a self-preserving mechanism. So it's almost like you're in a dormant, or air quote hibernating mode, in terms of your mental health and your physical health states, since depression is a cluster of symptoms, as you know, since your wife is a therapist as well, right? And then when you're ready, when your conditions are reprimed, then you're ready to get back out in the world. I sense some similarities what you just said with the punishments. You've done X, Y, and Z. You might not be ready yet to acclimate to the society that comprises of people. So let's give you an air quote timeout, punitive or not. And once you're ready, once your conditions are reset, then you can get back and re-acclimate. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I like that way of thinking about it. One thing I really like about that way of thinking about it is it puts a kind of emphasis on the reintegration that will come later. And I think we don't think about that enough, right? As one way I put it in the book is I say, nearly everyone that we imprison will live with us again. And that gives us reasons to actually treat them well while they're in prison, to treat them like human beings, which is, again, like prisons in America are horrific places where people are treated in all sorts of dehumanizing ways. And, that's connected, I think, to the fact that we have a lot of recidivism and crime. If you treat people poorly, you should probably expect poor treatment in return. I think there's a kind of, like the fact that we think that segregating you from the rest of society for a little while is an apt response to what you've done doesn't in any way justify dehumanizing you. And so I think what you say is a helpful reminder that if this is a temporary state, if it's for a little while, we should be spending a lot more time thinking about the reintegration and what that's going to look like and how we can help that to go well by the way we treat people while they're in prison.
I think the thesis of that is challenging the status quo and being a critical thinker. So in your chapter about authority, you said if you haven't written something worth criticizing, you haven't written something worthwhile. That's case in point with you cussing in your book, which I love. It's hilarious, equally hilarious and insightful. But why is that?
So, I said that as a kind of commentary on philosophy. Philosophers have this practice which often looks mean or even inhumane to outsiders. Like if you just parachute into a philosophy workshop where you're watching a professional philosopher present their work, as soon as they're done, people will start issuing objections and trying to show that you're completely confused or obviously mistaken or maybe subtly mistaken. And if you were to speak in a philosophy context and then nobody had anything to say, nobody pushed back, it's probably because they didn't find the argument very insightful or the
Mm.
framing of the puzzle very interesting. So things are going well for you when people are moved really to think hard about what you've had to say, right? And I'm sure that's true in some context outside of philosophy, but it's a kind of professional ethic of the way my crowd does things. Like you mentioned the sort of swearing in the book. There's a kind of funny origin story of that. I swear a fair bit, and my editor kept, as I would send her chapters, she kept, can I swear here? I don't know. Is it okay if I?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah, yeah. She kept saying you say fuck too much, and she kept taking them out. Then something I won't ruin the story because people really should go out and buy the book actually just for this story. Something really funny happened with our kids just in relation to
Hmm.
swearing. And as I had a long drive to take the next day, and as I was thinking about it, I thought, I'm going to write a whole chapter about swearing, or really about the word fuck, as a kind of fuck you to my editor, who actually I love and adore, and she thought the chapter was really funny. But the chapter's making a serious point,
Hmm.
right? Like a variety of serious points. One is it's doing some hard thought about something I found puzzling as a kid. Why is it that some words are off limits? What function is being served in our lives by treating some words as if they're off limits? I think that's an interesting question. But it's also a kind of illustration that everything in our lives can be an object of philosophy. The sacred, the profane, the mundane. There's probably really interesting puzzles to think through, like why are there some words that we're not supposed to say?
Yeah, I love the kitchen table discussion. I won't spoil the spoilers, but it's one of the funniest chapters I've read for sure. Also, I think you talk about this in the book, but a quick education. I urge people to look up the science of cussing and how that helps reduce someone's pain. It's fascinating. Like by you cussing based on the air quote abnormalities or the stigma around that word, the more stigmatized the word is, when you cuss that word, it reduces your pain index by significantly compared to the people who don't. So cussing does have benefits, right? I feel like this is what the
Yeah, for sure. I say in the book, like, of course, I want my kids to learn to swear. What I want them to do is to learn the context in which it's, appropriate to do it and the context in which it's not. And as you say, it has benefits physiologically, like the science on that's pretty clear. It also has social benefits. If you just think about the people you're closest to in
hmm
life, they're probably people whom you feel comfortable swearing around. And it's actually like the fact that norms can be transgressed in that way that is like signaling the closeness of the relationship and bringing about the closeness of the relationship. So both the science here is pretty cool, and actually I'm forgetting the name of the book that I recommend in that chapter. But if you pick it up, there's like another book about the science of swearing, and then a philosopher named Rebecca Roach, who I also talk about, just published an even deeper dive on the philosophy of swearing than my chapter. So there really is lots of like fun and I think like insight to be had in thinking about that topic.
I think the rule you gave your kids is you can cuss in the households at the summer camp, but not at the school or outside.
Yeah, so that covers most of it, right? So we said like, don't swear and don't use these words in ways that are mean, right? Not to insult people, not to hurt their feelings, right? But if you're blowing off steam or having fun with your friends, that's fine as long as you're like in the right kind of place. Like we don't do that at synagogue, right? We don't do that at school, but if you're in the basement hanging out with your friends or, at camp, that's fine. Like, and I think that's the lesson the kids need to learn. It's not never ever use these words. That lesson's not going to work anyway.
So I want to go into chapter 5 language, since you talked about the sacred, the profane, and the mundane. In the book, in the chapter language, it says philosophy should address every aspect of our lives, the sacred, the profane, and even the mundane. This contrasts the stigma that philosophy is for those that resides on a white ivory tower, philosophers. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, but that basically sums up why I wrote this book. So, like, the main thesis of the book is that children are astoundingly good philosophers, right? And it just comes naturally to them. And if you stop and you think about like what a child is, you'll realize why it comes naturally to them. Like they're born and like information is coming at them rapidly and they're trying to figure themselves out and figure out the world and they're constantly confused. They don't know what the standard explanations of things are. And so they're asking really puzzling questions about the way the world works and their place within it, and they're trying to reason those questions through. And so I wanted people to see, right, that some of the deepest philosophical questions, questions about whether we can know anything, questions about whether anything is true, questions about morality, like when or why does one person have authority over another, all of these questions are just present in our daily lives. They're especially present in our lives as children. And I wanted to say also, when you were a child, you had this kind of wonder about the world and this curiosity and this kind of fearless willingness to think things through. And I want to help people recapture that because I don't think that philosophy, I mentioned, my crowd, my tribe of professional philosophers who write in really abstract ways in academic journals that are inaccessible. And I love that part of philosophy. It's what I do for my day job. But I don't think that's all philosophy is or should be. And
Mm.
I actually don't even think it's the most important bit of it. I think the most important bit of philosophy is everyday people trying to think through the things that puzzle them or challenge them. And I wanted the book to give people some encouragement, both in the way that they talk to children for sure, but also in the way they think and reason in their own lives.
I think also evolutionally speaking, humans have an addiction for certainty. That's why the propensity towards pattern recognition, even though
Mm.
patterns are inherently flawed, since the past does not predict the future. But I think to do that, we must be willing to ask more questions than going with our innate desire to seeking the answers. So why is it more important to ask questions, Scott?
Well, so I think that I end the book with a quote from Bertrand Russell, who is one of the more prominent philosophers of the 20th century, and he says, "If philosophy cannot answer as many questions as we like, it at least shows the strangeness and wonder lurking just beneath the familiar." So one reason I'd say it's important to be asking questions is that like the world is a puzzling place, right? It's hard to figure out why we're here, or if there's an answer to the question why we're here, and how we ought to live, and how we fit with the rest of reality. And these questions that occur naturally to kids, I think, are just persistently interesting if we let ourselves appreciate that strangeness and wonder. So I think there's like part of the answer is there's just a lot here that's cool to think about, a lot that's fun, and it's a reminder of a kind of our limits as humans. Another answer I'd give is I think it's really important. You used the phrase earlier on, critical thinking. I think a lot of people kind of like flee to an ideology that's providing them some kind of certainty in the world, and they resist any questioning of it. Like in America, we like to say we're entitled to our opinions, and that's what you think. That's not what I think. That's not the way my household works. My kids know that they're not entitled to their opinions. They have to defend their opinions. So if you're going to make a claim, then you're going to get questioned. Why do you think so? What's your evidence? Could you be wrong? What would persuade you that we're wrong, that you're wrong? And I don't think if you look around the world, I have a colleague, Barb McQuaid, who's publishing a book on misinformation I guess next week, and all of the things that people persuade themselves of that are just not true. I think we could use a world in which people were willing to ask questions and sit with some uncertainty and recognize that they might not have the answers rather than, as you say, just, like sit with their certainty.
That I think kind of segues perfectly into my question because you're talking about the role of healthy skepticism, right? Misinformation, disinformation aside, since there is a difference between misinformation, which is mistakenly, and disinformation is disingenuous, which is more intentional. Your chapter 8 on knowledge speaks to just that. The thesis of we need to be skeptical, not for the sake of, but for the process of obtaining knowledge and truth. Any comments on that, especially in 2024, in light of primary season this year?
Yeah. So this chapter about knowledge starts with my older son Rex. One night at dinner when he was like 4 years old, just says, "I wonder if I'm dreaming my entire life." And this is wow. This is like catnip for a philosopher because this question occurs over and over again throughout the history of philosophy. So a lot of people associate it with Descartes, who asked it just the same way. My favorite version of this question comes from this ancient Taoist text called the Zhuangzi, and it imagines this guy named Zhuangzi, and it says one night he dreamed he was a butterfly floating and flitting around, and the next morning he was solid. When he woke up, he was solid, unmistakable Zhuangzi. But then he wondered, was he Zhuangzi who dreamed he was a butterfly, or was he a butterfly who was dreaming he was Zhuangzi? Right? So throughout human history, people have noticed that we have dreams when we sleep and then wondered if there's any way to distinguish, your awake state and your dream state and to know which is real. For Descartes, it was the foundation of a kind of skeptical project. He thought maybe I should doubt everything I think I know. And he wanted to try and doubt everything that he could doubt and then see if he could build back up a secure foundation of knowledge. I think it's really good to be in the habit of being skeptical, right? To wonder about ways in which you might go wrong because often we go wrong. But one thing I also am like really concerned to say in that chapter is I think in addition to using skepticism, you can also abuse it. And that happens a lot in our political culture. So an example I give at the end of that chapter is in conversations we have about climate change, right? So people will say things like, oh, it seems like maybe carbon emissions are raising the temperature, but do we really know that for sure? Maybe it could be these other things. And when they do that, right, they're trying to set the bar for knowledge super high, right? Because well, we may not know it for sure. Maybe there's nothing we can know for sure such that it's subject to no doubts. But we've piled up a ton of research by this point, right, that overwhelmingly, super strongly suggests that it's our carbon emissions that are changing the climate and having all of these bad effects that are going to be accelerating in the coming decades. And so when somebody asks you in a situation that requires action, oh, do you really know for sure? I want people to get in the habit of like questioning the questioner and being like, why would I need to know for sure? Why isn't it enough to be highly confident, right? Because we can, like, one thing that's cool about science is you can quantify often the chance that you've made a mistake. And when it comes to climate change, the chance that we've made a mistake is very, very small.
You talked about when people do that, they're raising the bar of the knowledge, right? Can you elaborate on that? And like, what do you think the intention is? Like, is it to dispute?
Yeah, so there's like a couple thousand year history of people arguing, philosophers talking about what does it mean to know something. And I think one of the coolest ideas to come out of this literature, in the last 100 years or so, is the idea that knowledge is context sensitive. So let me give you a kind of like easy illustration, right? So if I were to ask you, like suppose we're at a picnic and I said, oh, do you know if those brownies have nuts? And you said, no, they don't have nuts, right? I think whether you can say that statement, no, they don't have nuts, depends on why I'm asking. Right? So if you know that I just don't like nuts, right, then I think like the fact that you didn't see any nuts or there weren't any nuts in the brownie that you took from the table, that's probably good enough to tell me that there are no nuts. But if you know that I'm allergic to nuts and that I'm going to go into anaphylactic shock, right, the fact that you don't see any nuts is not a good enough reason to tell me that there are no nuts. Right? Then if I say, like, do you know if there are any nuts in that brownie? You need to say, no, I don't know. Right? And like maybe go find the person that made them or find the ingredient list. right? So, like, that's an illustration of the thought that whether we know something is sensitive to what the stakes of our being wrong. Like, how good evidence do we have to say that we know something, right? Like, it's, context sensitive. And this kind of like plays out in all kinds of ways, but one way it plays out is in this kind of climate change conversation, right? I think we know that our carbon emissions are causing damage to the environment, right? But when a politician who doesn't want to take action on climate change says, "Are we really sure?" He's trying to say, "Oh, we should be playing this kind of Descartes game of doubt everything that you know." And the thing
Mm.
about that Descartes game is it's paralyzing, and we don't want to be paralyzed when important problems are causing for responses. So that's why I want people to think, no, wait a minute, why is this a situation in which I have to be sure? Is it like the nuts and the brownies situation where there's an allergy, or is it more like the other kind of situation?
This is interesting because I personally categorize truth into three different categories: practical truth, similar to your practical philosophy, subjective truth, and objective truth. What is objective is not always subjective, right? And what is practical is not always objective, right? I know that you don't really believe in relativism in the book, and we will go down to that towards the end. We'll talk about God and your position in that, which is fascinating to
Yeah.
me. But any thoughts in terms of the way I categorize objective truth, subjective truth, and objective truth?
Yeah, well, so I want to hear you tell me a little bit more about the subjective truth category. What's in that category for you?
My faith. I'm a Christian, and I don't have empirical evidence to establish or substantiate my faith. But it's practical for me, and I believe it. So it's both subjective and practical. Another example is aliens, right? Or UFOs. Even if they were real, during this conversation, if a flying saucer lands outside my window, there's nothing I can do about it. I'm not going to change my way of living. There's nothing I could do. It just is or not.
Yeah, so I think this like the question about faith is really interesting, and there's a kind of conversation in the chapter on God about what faith is that draws on the work of a philosopher named Laura Bouchak, who says that faith is really more about your actions than your beliefs, right? So I think it's really interesting that you identified that with this kind of what you called practical truth, right? Which is to say, a person who has faith recognizes that they believe things that kind of outstrip their evidence, right? Like if I asked you, to provide your evidence, say that God exists, you're not gonna like be able to point me to the kind or quality of evidence that might support your scientific beliefs that say like HIV causes AIDS or something like that, right? And I think many people of faith recognize that they're taking a leap of faith, is a kind of famous phrase in philosophy, but the leap is a kind of action. It says like
Mm.
I'm committing myself to this way of being in the world, even though I don't have the evidence to establish that the world is actually this way. Faith is very powerful in lots of people's lives, and it's a force for good in lots of people's lives. I don't have the sort of faith that you were describing, but I admire it, right? Especially when it's a force for good in people's lives and in the world, right? And so I think that like I like your categorization, and I think like we probably agree, right? That like, well, there probably is an objective truth about whether or not there's a God, and it just turns out that's not so accessible to us, that objective truth. But there's this way of being in the world where you say, I'm going to orient my life around that truth, even if I can't establish it. And I think we all do this actually, maybe not in relation to God, but in relation to, say, our friend's loyalty or something like that. We're all taking little leaps of faith, even if we're not taking, the big leap of faith that's involved in religious belief.
Mm. A famous Christian philosopher, C.S. Lewis, he says that one of the fundamental characteristics of God is the unknowability. I think God aside, I think we must revere the unknowable characteristics of this reality, the world, the universe. And why do you think that's matter? Why should we revere that we can't know everything there is to know?
Yeah, so it's like there's different ways of revering it, right? So Lewis is like revering it in relation to God. And I write about another Christian philosopher, Marilyn McCord, who struggles with the problem of evil, which maybe we'll talk about a little bit, but accepts at the end that there's just going to be things about the world that she's not cognitively in a position to understand. And so I think that, like that attitude, I think is an important part of a lot of people's faith, right? That like things may not make sense to me, right? But they don't have to make sense to me, right? Because I have this faith that there's God to whom they make sense, right? Or who is making sense of them. Uh, I think it's like, but I revere it in a different kind of way. This kind of unknowability. I say in the book that one reason I don't have faith is because it's just like, it's kind of inconsistent with the way I am in the world, that I don't like to assume solutions. I just like to steep in the mystery, right? And so I think the world is kind of wondrous. That it exists at all is kind of astounding, whether you think that what's lurking behind that is God or just a kind of accident of physics, right? That it includes creatures like us who can like reflect on our own existence and our limited understanding of the world around us. That's also kind of astounding. And like appreciating the wonder in the world is something I think you can do whether you're religious or not.
Mm.
And I think it actually can kind of like shake you loose of your everyday concerns. If we're looking for a kind of practical reason to focus on this, I say early in the book, I say like, why do the laundry if the world may not be what it seems? One answer is like, the kids are going to school and the laundry's got to get done. But I do think like when things are stressful or when they're not going your way or when you are feeling overwhelmed, recognizing that our existence at all is kind of astounding, and the world is so much bigger than our lives and our day-to-day concerns, I think can provide some helpful perspective.
So let's go deeper into that, Scott. Why is that we don't matter, but things matter to us?
Yeah, so there's this philosopher named Tom Nagel who argues that our lives are kind of absurd. And why does he say our lives are kind of absurd? Well, like in our day-to-day lives, things strike us as really overwhelmingly important, and we get stressed and we get anxious and we're hopeful and we're hanging on how things turn out, right? But Nagel kind of invites people to like take a kind of bird's eye or God's eye perspective, or the perspective of the universe, sometimes people often say. And here we are, these tiny time-bound creatures, who will live probably less than 100 years out of a universe that's already been around here for 13 billion years already. And we're not at the center of the universe. We're just on the third rock circulating, from a star, which isn't even at the center of its own galaxy. And it's like, how important could we be, right? Like as individuals, even as all of humanity. And Nagel says, like, if you're looking from this perspective, the kind of like seriousness with which we invest our lives starts to feel a little bit absurd. And he thinks like, again, we're just capable of taking both of these kinds of perspectives. And I actually talk in the book about how I want to teach my children to be able to have both perspectives on their lives, to care about things really deeply, right? But also to recognize that there's a perspective from which the concerns of their lives don't matter much. And one of the coolest conversations I had in writing the book was with a Michigan philosophy colleague of mine, Sarah Buss, who was working on the question, like, how is it that some people have moral courage, display so much more courage in the face of moral difficulties than others? And Sarah thinks there's a lot of different answers, but she thinks one prominent one that I've been thinking about recently in connection with the murder of Navalny in Russia is she thinks there's a kind of trick of perspective that some people are capable of playing, where they think that what happens to other people, what happens in the world, what happens to my fellow citizens is really very important. But what happens to me is not very important, right? So they can kind of see their own life with this God's eye perspective, right? And she thinks that like that can be the source of a lot of courage. If you kind of let other people loom large but deny your own significance, then you're in a position to make sacrifices for other people that most of us couldn't bring themselves to make. And I think that's kind of a beautiful thought. And I think like you see that in the world in Navalny and other people who are not wrapped up in their own physical safety or their own material well-being and see themselves as kinds of insignificant. It actually endows them with this extraordinary power to help others.
From your research or your colleagues' research, did you guys come about, is it more of a genetic markers or is it learned behavior? Of course, the answer is always genetics and epigenetics. But like what
Yeah.
came up? Because I think that's fascinating about the topic of moral courage.
Yeah, so Sarah thinks there's lots of potential explanations, and I certainly don't think we could rule out, right, that there are, genetic explanations that some people are less risk averse with respect to their own safety, maybe because of the way that they're wired up, and that presumably, like, as you say, that, everything is nature and nurture. So, like early formative experiences may shape these kinds of attitudes. I don't know that there's, enough of these characters in the world that they've been sort of studied in the way that would tell us the answer in a fine-grained fashion. But I think that we know enough, actually, that like it shapes the way that I talk to my kids, right? That, I want them to get practice recognizing that first, I'm not more important than anybody else, but maybe I'm not important at all, right? If things aren't going well for me, but they're going well for others that I care about, that maybe that's actually an okay way for the world to be. So I would love to know, the answer to the question, but I don't know that there's research that can teach us yet.
Yeah, so I think I want to go into, I think, knowledge versus truth, right? I know you reference high bars of knowledge. You think X, Y, and Z, even though you don't have the absolute certainty of it, since you don't have deathly allergies to, like we talked about earlier. So what is the difference between knowledge and truth, or rather the process of acquisitions of knowledge and truth?
hmm So, like the question about truth is like, is there is there truth? Is there a way the world is? And it came up at my dinner table one night when my kids were younger. Rex asserted that Donald Trump is a bad president. This was, on the cusp of the last election. And Hank said, well, he's a bad president to us, but he's a good president to the people that like him. And I said, Hank, do you mean that the people who like him think he's a good president, but he's not really? And Hank said, no. I think that to them he's a good president, and to us he's a bad president. There's nothing in the middle that says who's right. And, I wanted to see, like, this is a kind of relativism. They have their truth, we have ours. And I wanted to see how far Hank would take it. And I said, Hank, if you and I go outside and I say it's raining and you say it's not, and then Hank said to me, well, it's raining for you and it's not raining for me, right? And this is like a very strong version of everyone gets their own truth. And I was kind of shocked to find out that my kid thought this way. But I do think a lot of people think this way. And it's a kind of rejection of there being truth in the world, right? Or at least it's an endorsement of only truth relative to our own perspectives and no truth that we all should accept. And I think it's kind of a dark way to think about the world. As I say in the book, right, like it imagines that our conflicts are irresolvable. Like, like the Catholic who's opposed to abortion and the feminist who supports abortion rights, that they're really just kind of talking past each other, saying things that are true from their own perspectives, but there's no real conversation to be had about what the right answer is. I very much believe in truth about whether it's raining, about moral questions like whether it's permissible to have an abortion. But that doesn't mean that we always have knowledge about the truth, right? So like, what's the difference between truth and knowledge? Well, truth is about the way the world is. Knowledge is about our mental states in relation to that world. Have we grasped the way the world is with the right kind of evidence that we can claim to know? And I think that very frequently we should be humble about it, right? And so, when I encounter somebody who has different moral beliefs, let's say, I think the reaction is not, to reject them, at least not in the first instance. What I should want to know is, why do they think so? Right? What evidence do they have? What experiences have they have in the world? What perspective are they bringing to this that maybe I don't appreciate yet, because we're all, we started this conversation talking about bias. We're all products of a particular place and time and a particular family, and that shapes. And so we should recognize that we're these really fallible creatures, right, with really limited perspectives on the world. And when we encounter someone who disagrees with us, we should want to understand their perspective, right? Not because they're irreconcilable perspectives on the truth, but because maybe coming to appreciate their experiences, their ideas, the evidence they would point to will help us better track the way the world is.
I think that's a beautiful distinction. And I think that brings me about the topics of morality versus ethics, right? Because at least the way I looked at it, ethics is like the societal norms or what is agreed upon by many people, and morality is more of the navigation individuals navigate by. Of course, you know that a lot better than I do. So what about morality versus ethics?
These words get used in all sorts of ways, and I don't know if there's one right way to use these words. I've got a friend who's a philosopher who always jokes that if you see in the newspaper that a politician has an ethics scandal, he did something bad in relation to money. And if you see that he's got like a moral problem, he did something bad in relation to sex. And then the joke is that so morality is about sex and ethics is about money, and that's obviously not right. I tend to think of like ethics is a slightly broader category than morality. That ethics is about how we should live in the world, and morality is about what we owe other people. And like, what rights do you have, what ways can I wrong you, what are the proper attitudes, it's like interpersonal relationships. And ethics is a broader category because it outstrips that. Like, should I seek knowledge, should I seek physical fitness? But again, that's just like one way of many in which you could use the word. So you were drawing a distinction, I think, is also a really important distinction. Like the question of what are the social norms around here, what kind of conduct do we expect or condemn, a kind of like sociological question. And that's a separate question from, like the actual rightness or wrongness of various forms of conduct. And I think we always have to be willing to question our social norms and ask whether we have good reason for them. So for a long time, people condemned homosexuality, and we've come to a place where we think, no, that doesn't make any sense. There's nothing that's like when you stop and think about it, there's no reason to regard this as immoral, right? Like, it's just a different kind of love, and but a kind of love that ought to be respected in the way that other kinds of love are. And so, I don't want to police the way people use words like ethics and morality, but they can help us track important distinctions like the one that we're pointing to.
I think I have to ask these questions because I also want to know what came first, morality or ethics?
Oh, yeah. I don't know. I mean, so I think there's a sense in which, if we're using the distinction as I just described it, that morality comes first. Because I think that, once there are human beings, it's possible to ask questions about how they ought to treat one another, right? What forms of respect they owe each other, how they ought to live together. And different cultures will develop different answers to these questions, right? And different social practices and different social norms. But I think the questions themselves have a kind of timeless nature, right? That wherever there are people, there will be questions about how they ought to treat each other.
Yeah, as you know, we have to take law and ethics exam as part of the licensure process, right? Mm-hmm. But then law and ethics for our discipline is different than licensed family and marriage counselors. It's different for different states, different jurisdictions, so to speak. So, and I was asking that question because, as you said, ethics is like a society. So it's asking which came first, society or people. Obviously, people came first, and they established society.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm sure the anthropologists will tell us that we're just fundamentally social creatures, like all primates, and that we have never lived independently of society. I think that's surely true. And so, maybe the better answer to your question is wherever there have been people, there have been both these kind of moral and ethical questions. And you're absolutely right. That, like one common use of the word ethics is in relation to like the standards of a particular profession. So my students also take their professional ethics exam where they're getting tested in the ethical rules that apply to lawyers. And lawyers have a joke about there's a test we all take called the MPRE, Multi-State Professional Responsibility Exam. And they tell you if you haven't studied for it, just look at the four choices and pick the second most moral, right? That a lawyer won't do the most moral thing, right? They'll do the second most moral thing. And, it's like the joke isn't 100% correct, but it's tracking something important, right? That like our professional lives often warp our responsibilities, right? So they're things that your client would tell you in confidence, right? That if you were just a person on the street and they told you that, maybe you'd think, oh, I need to, tell someone about this or warn someone or, take some action. But you play a distinctive role in relation to them. You are the person with whom they can share things, have these kinds of confidential conversations so they can get the kind of assistance that you can provide, and so they feel comfortable sharing the information with you that you need in order to provide it. And that kind of changes your responsibilities in relation to them. Like you're not going to treat them, the way that a friend or a stranger might treat them if they said similar things.
If you don't mind, I want to go down this rabbit hole a little bit more. Speaking of law and ethics. So as you know, what is unethical is not always illegal. And what is legal is not always unethical. Why is that the case?
So I think that it's the case for something I alluded to earlier, which is to say legal institutions are institutions, right, that have limited tools and capabilities to gather information about the world, to respond. So like the criminal law, right, responds to people who do things that are wrong in extraordinarily disruptive ways. It basically brings a sledgehammer down onto their lives and also the lives of the people around them, right? Like if you put a father in prison for a robbery that he committed, that's going to have devastating impacts, not just in his life, but also on his children's life, potentially in the life of his community. And so, like, it's super important, actually, right, that we not respond to all wrongdoing with the kind of sledgehammer of the criminal law, right? And actually, I think, like, in our society, we use that sledgehammer way too often. We're responding to too much and disrupting our communities and our family lives too much, right? But I'll give you a kind of another example. So, like, I teach a case to my students about a young couple in Massachusetts that are having sex. And, I won't describe in detail what they were doing. As I say to my students, like, it wouldn't surprise your grandmother, right? Like, like they're having sex in a perfectly standard way. It just so happens that her body lands on his body in an awkward way and causes him a significant injury, right? And he sues her. And I think it's a really interesting question why he sues her. But the court's like, no, we're not going to have a trial about whether she was being careful enough in the way that they were having sex. We're not going to ask a jury to come decide whether, she was being negligent or not. Because again, this is a kind of like institution. It's not going to solve every problem. Not every problem is going to be a problem that we want to have aired in court. I will just say as an aside, in case people are wondering, he sued her, but I don't think he chose to sue her. I think he had to have an expensive surgery, and his health insurance company wanted reimbursement for the money they paid out. And she was covered by an insurance policy, a renter's insurance policy, because they were having sex in her apartment. And so really, again, this like highlights the institutional nature of the law. What you had here was two insurance companies that were fighting about who had to pay for this expensive surgery through these two people. And so an answer to the overall question is, why does law sometimes differ from morality? It's because we don't actually want to live in a world where every moral problem is litigated in court. Litigation is awful. We don't want to have to go to court and describe the ways we were having sex. We don't want to, if what we really need is an apology or somebody to, lend us a helping hand, courts aren't good at, if a court demands that someone apologizes, it's not all that helpful because it doesn't strike us as sincere. It's not valuable in the way a genuine apology is. So I think it's just a kind of like limitations of what legal institutions can do.
Did he win the case or lose the case?
So it was dismissed because
Oh, I see.
the court. I mean, the reason I teach the case actually is because the we'll just dive deep on the legal doctrine here for a second. The court said that she didn't owe him a duty of care when they were having sex, and and as I say to my students, this is an astounding claim. You might think if there's any area of your life in which you should care for another human being, it's when you're having that sort of intimacy with them. But why was the court saying that? It was their way of saying that we don't recognize a legal claim here. We don't see not a moral duty. I bet if you asked them, right, do you think that she ought to have been like taking care for his safety and vice versa? I bet they'd say yes. What they meant is we're not going to recognize that right in court as one that
Hmm.
we enforce and have trials about and lawsuits. And so as I often tell my students, like the first question that like you might think a court is asking about is what were the responsibilities of these parties? But ultimately the question they have to ask is which of their responsibilities should we enforce in court, right?
Hmm.
Not like what do we think good behavior was, because not everything is appropriate subject matter for legal proceedings.
Yeah, I appreciate the nuances. And once again, I'm asking these questions because I think it's important to not just deconstruct what we think we know, but there's so many these intricacies in life, like legal framework aside, right?
Yeah.
But so many people, going back to the beginning of conversations, we take what we receive, we internalize it as truth, and everything we operate around our operational points becomes skewed and biased. And the only way to do that is to trim away the saturated fat. You have to trim away the layers and get to the bottom of it's like onions. When you peel back the layers, it hurts. You shed a couple of tears. In my case, shed a lot of tears, but it's
Mm.
worth it, right? But I think that's what philosophy is. And I think that's what art of thinking is.
Yeah. Well, so I was going to say exactly what you said. That is what philosophy is, right? I sometimes, you called it earlier the art of thinking, which is also what my son Rex said one day when I asked him to describe what philosophy is. But I often think of it like it's thinking in slow motion, right?
Hmm.
Like, let me go step by step. Let me question myself. Let me, as I tell my students, we would like to find the answer. It'd be great if we find an answer at the end of this. But a lot of times philosophy is just understanding why the puzzling things are puzzling, right? Like, and I might make progress if I can explain to you why I'm confused about how we should punish people. Oh, because I see like the various possible aims, right? Like we could be after deterrence, we could be after retribution, we could be after rehabilitation. And also, I see the consequences that it has in people's lives and the way they often outstrip what their aims are. Well, now I'm in a better position at least to understand the problem, even if I don't yet know a solution. Or if I think like, oh, this is the solution from now because I understand the problem, I might be willing to question it down the road.
Hmm. So can we get practical for a second? So Scott, how do we self-evaluate to trim away the sad fat and false layers and beliefs that are no longer serving us?
That's a really great question. I think that critically and generously, I would say, are like two important parts of it. So I have been emphasizing throughout the importance of questioning what you know. And also on the practical side, I think questioning what you're justified. So we said, like, we can always ask a question about our social norms, about the way we do things. This is one thing I think children are really terrific at, right? Because they don't know why things are being done the way they are, and they challenge their parents, right? And so, like, they give you the chain of whys, why this, why that, over and over and over again. And so I think, like, first, like, questioning, being open to the possibility that you're wrong or don't have the justification that you think you do. I think that's really important. But I also think it's important to, you talked about self-evaluation, to be generous with yourself,
Hmm.
right? Which is to say, it's easy to go through the world thinking everybody else has this sorted out and I don't. And I often say, like, I think one reason that I am a philosopher is because I still feel like a little kid with lots of questions and uncertainties. But I think like one of the deepest insights I have come to, in my 47 years is realizing there are no adults, right? There is nobody around here. I don't care where you are, what you're doing, who has this all figured out and sorted and knows just the right way to do things. And so critical but generous in not demanding more of yourself than you would demand of others, and recognizing that you're a step ahead of the game if you're trying to get better, and if you're being critical, it doesn't have to be harsh.
Hmm. I appreciate the mental health as a through line, since that's the ethos of this podcast. And I love working on relationships as a therapist because I think in the container relationships, it's always a reflections and extensions of the relationship with the self. Romantic relationships, companionships, and so on. So by that definition, it means if we do not know how to love ourselves, accept ourselves, the good, the bad, and the ugliness, and if we do not extend grace and compassion towards our journey, since everyone has different timeline, that means we are always going to extend and be less charitable and generous towards others. So I appreciate that highlight.
Yeah, I've been thinking. I've got this new project where, kind of inspired by a football game I was watching last year, not this most recent playoffs, but the year before, when the Chiefs played the Bengals in the AFC Championship game. There was a player for the Bengals who made a crucial mistake at the end of the game. Got a penalty for shoving Patrick Mahomes when he was out of bounds, and it made it much easier for the Chiefs to win and go to the Super Bowl, which they did. And the player was really upset afterwards. He was crying on the sidelines, and his teammates kind of rallied around him, right? Were really supportive. They were like, "Oh, one mistake doesn't lose a game." The coach said, "We're not going to make it about that one play." One of his teammates actually stood next to him in the locker room, and kind of weeded out questions from reporters that he thought the guy who made a mistake shouldn't have to answer. He's like, "Stupid question, bro. Ask a better question." And I found the whole thing just really moving. Like, and actually, I thought it was kind of like a virtuoso moral performance. I thought the player who made a mistake, his name was Joseph Osai. I thought he had to show his teammates that he regarded himself as responsible. That's what he did when he was crying on the sidelines. But then his teammates had to do what they did for him, right? They had to rescue him from this responsibility and share it together, right? By saying, "Hey, no, like the team didn't play well enough. It's not Joseph's fault. We all could have played a little better, and then we wouldn't have been in that position." And so you're talking about the kind of relationships between like individuals and like their partners, or like that, like you're in a relationship of a marriage, you're in a relationship of teammates. And I think in our day-to-day lives, we all understand, right, the need to help each other with our failings, right? Not to like get up at that press conference and be like, "Oh yeah, this was Joseph's fault," right? And I think we intuitively understand that with our friendships and with our spouses and so on. But we're maybe not always good at understanding with respect to ourselves. And I should say, like, I don't know whether we should be as understanding of ourselves as we are of other people. I have a former student colleague, Zoe Johnson King, who is interested in the question why we are often harsher on ourselves than we are on other people. And she thinks there may be a kind of virtue in that, right? That we're like, because it keeps you from being self-justifying, from making excuses for yourself, right? So like she thinks there's something to be said for being like free flowing with excuses for other people, right? But like a little bit holding back on excuses for yourself. And I find that view attractive, but I also think it can go too far, right? Where you hold yourself to a standard that's unreasonable for any human being. I think a lot of people do that, and it's the source of a lot of difficulty in their lives.
I think you embody practical philosophy because you can philosophize even a football sideline situation.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I said earlier on that I think that like the most interesting philosophy is actually not the professional philosophy. It's just like happening in the world around us, and and that's why I wrote the book, is just to try and show people that these really important philosophical questions are just present in their day-to-day lives, whether it's a football game or a conversation at the dinner table, and we're missing out on something if we don't, take a moment and think it through.
So, Scott, what do we lose by losing our capacity to imagine without borders?
Oh, I've been thinking about that a lot lately because my kids are getting older, right? So in a lot of stories that I tell in the book, they range between, like the ages of 2 and 10, but now they're 11 and 14. And a big shift happens in adolescence. So Gareth Matthews was a philosopher who I think was like the most alive to the philosophical abilities of children. And he said that based on his studies, kids were spontaneously interested in philosophical questions between the ages of about 3 and 8,
Hmm.
but it kind of slowed down afterwards and it didn't disappear in adolescence. Like you can prompt an older child to have philosophical conversations, but it doesn't come like as easily or as naturally to them. And I think there's two things that are driving that change. One is little kids, like they don't even really have a conception of the like other people's perceptions of them, so they just don't worry about whether they seem silly or whether they're making mistakes, and it makes them kind of fearless little thinkers who will share their thoughts about the world and will think thoughts about the world, big thoughts, even if they might be wrong. Whereas adolescents, of course, like have become more engaged socially, and they really do worry about what other people think of them. Like they desperately don't want to seem, silly or out of step with their peer group. Another thing I think that's happening is like they've learned what the standard explanations of things are, and they've learned that a serious person maybe doesn't stop and ask what is truth, and spend a lot of time thinking about that. And so what I think is lost is this sense of wonder at the world and this like drive to be creative in the way we approach it and to question the things that we think we know. I don't think there has to be a practical upshot to that. Like,
Hmm.
I'm enough of a philosopher to think that like, we're in the world, we should try to make sense of it and it's fun. But I think there are often practical upshots to that. That, like, we know from human history a lot of people we admire most were slightly out of step with the world around them and willing to think differently and to challenge. And, I think that's a trait worth cultivating in our kids and ourselves.
Hmm. Yeah, it reminds me of individuals with autism or autistic folks, right? Some of their characteristics are very childlike. Of course, there's executive motor dysfunctioning and lack of development, sure, but science aside. But it's interesting that when those characteristics are displayed in children, of course, yeah, we respect it, we admire it, we acknowledge it, we accept it. But when those same characteristics happen in adults, air quote, because like you said, I think adults or parents or just older children having children for the first time, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then we immediately judge them based on the social norms or what we think as air quote appropriate or normal. And I think about that a
Mm-hmm.
lot.
Yeah, there's a kind of game people play where it's like diagnose the historical figure, like they do this with philosophers. And, I mean, the record's pretty thin and, nobody has the right therapeutic relationship to say what these diagnoses actually are. But, like it's probably a good thing for the world that, we're not all wired up in the same way because it gives us a lot of different perspectives and, access to a much broader way of thinking about the world than if we all were neurotypical, I guess, as we say now.
Hmm. Yeah, one of the biggest things I love talking on the podcast and offline is the importance and the role of thought diversity. Are you concerned about the death of that? Because we definitely, the thought diversity, our willingness to be charitable to other people's way of thinking, their operational points and references. Like we don't really talk to other people that we disagree with. Polarity is one of the byproducts of that.
So I think I'm not concerned about the lack of thought diversity in itself because like people believe like a wild array of things. What I'm concerned about is, as you say, like the lack of dialogue across differences that we've kind of like sorted ourselves like both online and in physical communities to live around people from similar backgrounds who hold similar sorts of views and consume the same sources of news. So I'm concerned a lot about that, and I'm concerned about the kind of habits of mind
Mm.
that lead people, towards conspiracy theories like QAnon and the like. And I do think that, one pitch I make in the book is for more philosophy education at a younger age.
Mm.
Um, that I think that one thing I've really enjoyed doing when my kids were younger was visiting their elementary school classes to talk about philosophy. So there's a really wonderful resource maintained by the Prindle Institute called Teaching Children Philosophy, which has modules for picture books that are in a lot of people's homes, just like the most popular picture books. And what they've done is they've sort of like written up these like almost little lesson plans of here are philosophical issues raised in these stories and questions you can ask your kids as you read. There's a kind of primer for parents. You don't need any background in philosophy, and you don't want to ask them. There might be 20 questions. You don't want to ask 20 questions when you read a story, but maybe, pick a question or two or have a conversation. But when I would go to these classes, my students, my kids' classmates, they were hungry for these kinds of conversations.
Mm.
And, we set some norms about them, right? We're going to talk one person at a time. We're going to listen and we're going to try and understand. We're not just going to disagree, right? We're going to explain why we think differently and invite the other person to explain how they think. And, there are parts of the world where philosophy is a more regular part of early education. And I think we would do well to mimic that here because it would help cultivate habits of mind that would be useful later in life.
And by habits of mind, do you mean like echo chamber and mind hives?
Yeah, so the folks that sort of study misinformation, disinformation, they have this distinction between epistemic bubbles and echo chambers, right? And so an epistemic bubble is, it's like you only have access to one sort of information, or you only choose to access one sort of information. You only watch, say, Fox News. You might be in an epistemic bubble. There's a philosopher named C.T. Nguyen who teaches the University of Utah who writes about this stuff a lot. And he says he's actually not worried about epistemic bubbles because they're kind of easy to pop. Anytime you encounter another piece of information, well, you're popping your bubble, right? And most people in our society, it turns out, don't just watch Fox News. Even if they do watch Fox News, they're encountering other information in conversations or in newspapers and other places. He says like echo chambers are the much bigger problem. So what's an echo chamber? It's a community that is training its members to discount any contrary sources of information, right? So they're just teaching you in advance that anybody who disagrees with us, that's the enemy. They're untrustworthy. They hate America. They're lying to you. And they're trying to inoculate you against these encounters that you might have outside the epistemic bubble. And I do think that's very worrisome. If you have these habits of mind of assuming that people who disagree with you are like evil or bad intentioned, then you're not in a position to encounter evidence that really might challenge your beliefs, really might lead you to a different place. And I don't want to leave the impression that all of these problems are on the right, right? Like I think the left has a serious, set of problems too, right? That like the original anti-vax community in the United States is a kind of left-wing phenomena that's like teaching its members that doctors are ill-intentioned and the medical community is just trying to profit off you or harm you, and to try and train people not to be willing to ask the question, well, how effective are these vaccines really, and what are the risks really, and what do the studies say? And so it's a problem for all of us, and I think we can all get better at being open-minded and willing to have conversations with people that disagree with us.
I think a relevant concept is cognitive dissonance, with everything that you said, right? And of course, dissonance is just our ability or inability to hold seemingly conflicting ideas. And we either are going to address our beliefs by changing our behaviors, or we're going to address our behaviors by changing our beliefs. Because most people can't swim in the dissonance or the gray.
Mm-hmm.
And it is becoming more and more problematic because a lot of people lack insights and awareness, which takes a lot of cultivations and practices.
Yeah, I had a philosophy mentor at Oxford, John Gardner, who liked to say people badly want to be justified,
Hmm.
right? And in some ways, this is good actually, that people like they want to be in good standing, whether it's in respect to their beliefs or in respect to their actions, and that's a good thing to want actually. But it's not a good thing to want if your way of like coming to see yourself as justified is ignoring contrary evidence or ignoring the harm that you're causing to others. And I think again, like when we think about like habits of mind that philosophy can help cultivate, um, like the ability to say, I don't know, I'm not sure, I think I may be wrong. The very first paper I assign my students is a paper by a philosopher named David Lewis, who was one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century. He didn't write about law, but he became puzzled about something, a legal puzzle. The puzzle is, why do we punish people who succeed in committing crimes more than we punish people who attempt to commit crimes,
Hmm.
even when the question whether they succeed or fail is beyond their control? Like maybe we should just puzzle anybody who's attempting murder the same, whether or not they succeed. It's a really interesting question. And he supplies a kind of answer to it, but then he gets to the end and he says, I don't know if I'm right, and actually, I think I have to be wrong, but I can't see where I went wrong. And I think this is like really the ethic of the philosopher is I'm going to do the best I can. I'm also going to be honest about what I can show and what I can't and where my questions still are. It's really different, I should say, than the ethic of a lawyer. Like the ethics of the lawyer are, let me try and offer an argument that's persuasive. And if I can kind of obscure the difficult bit so the court doesn't really stop and think about it, that's my job, right? Whereas the job of a philosopher is, let me really try and understand this. And if I get to something I don't understand, then I should just say, I don't understand. Let other people know that, and maybe they'll help fill in the gaps.
Hmm. Yeah, it's I think with this as I started this introductions, with the world becoming more and more complex with the rise of AI, technological frontier, all these things, I think we really have to accept what we don't know and be willing to internalize that unknowability and live in that area a little bit more by being more receptive to whatever information comes our way. Um,
Yeah.
I, I want to ask you a question about self-deception because I think that's what you're alluding to with that response. And self-deception has interesting psychological, practical implication. Like for those people who don't have cultivated practices and self-awareness, whether they're consciously choosing to be deceptive or choosing to lie to themselves, consciously or otherwise, it's practical because if you choose not to lie to yourselves with the dissonance we talked about, it actually decreases their quality of life because a lot of people struggle with shame and guilt and dissonance. So they will lie to themselves practically to navigate their lanes of life or their perspective. But philosophically, Scott, what are your thoughts on self-deception and the role, if any?
Yeah, as a philosopher, I've got a kind of bias towards self-knowledge rather than self-deception. There's this famous Socrates line: "The unexamined life is not worth living." It's not the claim, I think, that examining your life is going to make your life go better, right? Maybe as you say, like deceiving yourself, right, is sometimes like going to lead to more happiness or like an easier path through the world. Um, so why a bias towards the examined life or a bias towards self-knowledge? I think it's in part because of of the value that we rightly place on authenticity. So there's this like very famous thought experiment from a philosopher named Robert Nozick, who imagined what he called the experience machine. Right. So here's how it works. You can go in this machine. Maybe it's like the greatest virtual reality machine ever possible. And you say what experience you want to have in there, and you'll have any experience in there, right? And you'll forget that you made a choice to go in. So if you say, I want to be a rock star, you will step into this machine and you will live the life of a rock star, right? You won't have any awareness that it's not real, right? Or if you say, I want to be an Olympic gold medalist, or you say, I just want to be, the greatest forensic psychologist, like whatever it is, you pick. You're going to step into this, like, you're going to live it. And, Nozick asked the question, would you go in the machine? And actually, I'm curious, would you go in the machine? You can never come out, but you're going to live the whatever life you picked in that machine.
No, because my life is highly designed.
Yeah, I mean, so most people say they wouldn't go in the machine, right? Notwithstanding the fact that like you're going to be happier in the machine by whatever metric of well-being, right? Because you picked it, right? Like you're gonna live a great life in that machine, except like the hang up for a lot of people is you're not really living that life. It's just being simulated for you,
Hmm.
right? Like it's not that I want to experience being a rock star. It's that I want to be a rock star. In my case, I don't actually want to be a rock star. It's not that I want to experience like playing like third base for the Atlanta Braves. It's I want to be right the third baseman for the Atlanta Braves, right? And so like the virtual reality just doesn't give me what I want. And I think self-deception is kind of similar,
Hmm.
right? It's it may make you in some sense happier, but then there's a kind of inauthenticity to the way you're moving through the world.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly because in the military, since I'm a veteran, we're taught to seek out the path of least resistance, obviously. But I think in life, I think it's worthy to embark on the path of high resistance because
Mm.
post traumatic growth, right, the pain teachers, seeking knowledge and seeking truth, even though it comes at a cost, psychologically,
Mhm.
emotionally. But I do think it's worth it because I think all worthy things in life usually requires great effort.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, I'm thinking of Ryan Holiday, who runs the Daily
Hmm.
Stoic and writes these really great books about Stoic thoughts. And I think the title of his book is something like "The Obstacle is."
Is the
One of his
way.
books is something like "The Obstacle is the Way." Yeah, and I do think that like when the only goal is to achieve a particular outcome, right? Then, as you say, like your military training, find the easiest way to that outcome can make a lot of sense, right? But when your goal is, become a better person or have the most authentic achievement, then, going through the obstacle is often the way.
I feel like we can talk for 3 more hours, but I do want to be respectful of your time. So, what is the way for people to connect with you, check out your book, and any other projects you want to share?
Terrific. So the book is called Nasty British and Short: Adventures in Philosophy with Kids, and it's available at bookstores near you and online, Amazon. Where there's an audio book. I think it's being translated into something like 18 different languages.
Mm.
Half dozen of those are already out. So hopefully the book is easily acceptable. I'm on Twitter at @Hershovitz. And I teach at the University of Michigan, so if you want to track me down more robustly, there's a page there to connect. And then occasionally, I love to, as you can tell, I love to find the philosophy in everyday life. So I occasionally write op-eds for New York Times or the Atlantic or other places where you might catch my byline.
So before we close out, Scott, we talked a lot about from moral and ethics to biases and emotions to mental health to compassion. Before we close out today's amazing conversation, if I give you a giant messaging board, is there anything that we haven't talked about you really feel called to share to close this out?
Oh wow. I get a giant messaging board. I think I just want to reiterate the main message of the book actually, which is like if you have children, if you're an aunt or an uncle or you're a teacher or there's like a kid who's your neighbor, right? They are this like untapped resource of like the possibility of extraordinary conversations. And actually, if you talk to kids about philosophical questions, you can have a different kind of interaction with them than you can in almost any other way. Like most of the time when adults and kids interact, it's kind of hierarchical. The adult is in the role of teacher or authority. But like I make the case in the book that kids are philosophers and probably better than philosophy at you in some way. So ask them about ask them what they're wondering about and take their ideas seriously and follow the goofy conversations that you can have with them wherever they go. It's going to be good for that kid to kind of get that support and like to see that you're interested in what they think about the world. But it's also going to be good for you because it's going to help you recapture some of the wonder kids have at the world.
To close this out, I hope that we establish that philosophy does matter and there is an active and practical role in philosophy in everyday life. Whether you want to analyze a football tape like Scott did about the supporting role of their teammates and so on, or you just want to improve your way of thinking, be more critical of the way of life and whatever misinformation's at bay. But I hope the underline is we need to be self-compassionate, be charitable to ourselves, our mistakes and flaws, and then be better in the process. But yeah, Scott, appreciate your time. I know this is on a Saturday, and folks like you are very protective, so I appreciate your time and glad you got over I hope you get over your cough and cold or flu.
Well, thank you so much. I feeling better and found this energizing. It's really great to talk to you.
Awesome. To all the listeners, if you have made it till these ends, we appreciate your attention, as attention is the number one commodity of 2024. I hope you discover something more insightful and practical from today's conversation with Scott. If you derived any value, please share this episode with one friend only. It's free for you, but priceless for the podcast's growth. And as always, I'll include all of Scott's information in the show notes below. And I encourage you to seek curiosity over fear in the next week's train of Discover More.